Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Wednesday special. Just a quick note, due to severe lack of time, due to unpacking all the various boxes and getting my hands on the rest of my reference library, and also due to the loss of voice that was pending when I recorded the dry dock, I haven't had all that much time to set up a script for this Wednesday special, as a couple of the vital research books I would needed for the one I had planned were still in storage until about 6 hours before this recording was made. So rather than give you an incomplete special that I haven't been able to comfortably say I've fully researched, I will instead go with something slightly different. I hope you'll enjoy it. Today it's going to be story time with Uncle Drac, and today's story is going to be taken from the book Against the Odds, Battles at Sea, 1591 to 1949, by Alexander McKee. It's a very entertaining read if you ever get a chance to have a look through it. And today's story that we're going to cover from within that book is going to be the story of Sir Richard Grenville of HMS Revenge. And no, that's not the several tens of thousands of ton battleship of World War One. This is the Elizabethan galleon that most famously, for those interested in naval history, fought as Drake's flagship during the Spanish Armada attempted invasion of England. This we pick up on a few years later down the line. So, let's get into it. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 had gone to people's heads. English prestige had reached a peak in England and abroad, even in Spain. But looked at coldly, the Armada had not really been defeated. It had been frustrated and driven off, partly because of bad Spanish plans, partly because of England's strength at sea, and partly because of the weather. And to be honest, the weather is really the biggest factor there. The only Spaniards who'd actually managed to land in England had been prisoners. In 1589, a year after the Spanish Armada had been sent home without really achieving anything, the English Armada sailed for northern Spain and Portugal, with orders first to mop up any damaged ships that had returned from the Armada and were still in northern ports, where they were being repaired, then to capture Lisbon, and then to take the Azores as a base from which to harass and maybe cut Spain's communication with the Americas, looting all that gold and silver they keep bringing back. This was supposed to be assisted by an uprising of the Portuguese, who were supposedly eagerly awaiting them. The English Armada was organised on pretty much doomed to fail lines. Command, instead of being under a single commander, such as with the English efforts against the Spanish Armada, had been divided between Sir Francis Drake and Sir John Norris for the sea and land forces, respectively. Both commanders were very competent, but there was no one in overall charge. And the English were about to discover that defending yourself against an invasion is somewhat easier than planning and executing an invasion yourself. The Spanish, of course, having just had a massive fleet rather badly damaged and in large part destroyed, had taken most of the lessons of this to heart. To ensure the safety of less bulky but more valuable cargoes, such as that lovely gold and silver that was being shipped across from South America, the Spanish had proposed building a type of ship that was small, fast, very well armed, but could run away from a larger galleon, even a race-built one, and if assaulted by a smaller ship like a pinnace, could defeat it. These were called galizabras. However, as well as these effectively early blockade runners, King Philip of Spain, not particularly impressed with the English, had decided to also build a full-on war fleet that was capable of escorting the convoys of merchant ships across the Atlantic from the Caribbean for those carrying the larger cargoes, which were still valuable, but could not perhaps be fitted into one of the new galizabras. So, in this vein, a dozen ocean-going galleons were being built in Biscay and the surrounding area. 9 more were being built at Lisbon in Portugal, and there were contracts out for a dozen others in various ports. The English, of course, were happily unaware of any of this, and so their plan was to send out small squadrons of ships in relays to cruise along the treasure fleet routes. And it was just such a squadron which Sir Richard Grenville would command. Now he was serving aboard the Revenge, this being, as we said, Drake's old flagship, under the overall command of Grenville, who was a somewhat inexperienced nobleman. Now, the Azores, which were one of the English targets, are on the same kind of latitude as southern Spain, but further out into the Atlantic. And in the July that found the Revenge cruising off their coast, it was fairly pleasant to be at sea. There were several young gentlemen volunteers aboard the Revenge, and they were quite happily writing letters home, talking about all the loot and all the ships and all the prize money they were about to get. However, they were in for something of a shock. The next set of letters they'd write after this sort of mid-July summer cruise would be from a prison in Lisbon. By the end of July, sickness had swept through the English fleet. 50% of the men were out of action, and some of the worst affected ships were in a really bad way. The Nonpareil, the worst affected, had to be sent home. In the Revenge, she had a crew of 250, but 90 of those were incapacitated. 4 months cruising in hot weather in enemy waters before the causes of scurvy were known. It's not really unexpected that was going to happen, really. But whether or not they were in enemy waters, something had to be done to curb the rising sickness. They had to find an anchorage, get the sick ashore until they either recovered or died. Either way, you didn't want them on the ship. And then get everything out of the ship, clean it thoroughly, and then bring everything back on board, and anything that had gone mouldy be left ashore. This took a lot of time, and since the ballast was one of the things that was removed, whilst this was all happening, the ships were very vulnerable. As a result, the small squadron stationed a fast pinnace out to the west to give a warning of the approach of a fleet from the Caribbean and South America, i.e. the treasure fleet they were looking for. They thought, based on past experience, that maybe only a few of these vessels would be warships of any substantial size, and most would be fairly helpless merchant ships. But that assumption was a severe miscalculation. So, by August 1591, the English squadron off the Azores was now consisting of 4 galleons of medium size, this being the Defiance, the Bonaventure, the Golden Lion, which had come in to replace Nonpareil, and the Revenge. They were all around 500 tons displacement. And there were also 3 smaller ships, the Foresight, the Crane, and the Charles being a pinnace of only 60 tons, whilst the Foresight and the Crane were 250 to 300 ton ships. There was also another pinnace, the Moon, but that had been sent away to look for supplies. 6 more ships were on their way. They were merchant ships, but been converted to be fairly well armed, and they were about the same displacement as Foresight and Crane at between 200 to 300 tons, but they were still stuck in Plymouth due to bad weather. They would only be a few days' sail away from their rendezvous point once the weather picked up again, but this wasn't really going to happen, as we will see. Elsewhere, the Earl of Cumberland had a much more powerful squadron keeping an eye on the Spanish coast, and part of this force spotted the emergence of Don Alonso de Bazan's rather formidable brand new fleet heading out for the Azores. Cumberland, whose own forces couldn't match this new force of heavy ocean-going galleons, sent a fast pinnace, the Moonshine, to warn his compatriots aboard Revenge and the other ships of the new unexpected danger. The Moonshine took something of a risk coming close enough to the Spanish ships to count them, and then legged it all the way for the Azores. Unknown to the Revenge and its companions, there were now 4 groups of ships all heading towards them. The big treasure fleet they were expecting from the West Indies was in fact on its final stage of its journey across the Atlantic. There was the 6 armed merchantmen from Plymouth, who are now on their way. There was the English squadron, which was now coordinating around the Azores, and there was the fleet of the Spanish Navy under Alonso de Bazan, 55 ships strong. 20 of them warships, 7,000 men. And against that, there were 4 ships full of sick men, a pinnace, and 2 intermediaries. Yeah, this wasn't going to go very well, was it? Helpfully, during this period of time, the Spanish and English calendars were completely different. So, according to the English calendar, it was the 20th of August. According to the Spanish calendar, it was the 30th of August. On this day, whichever one you choose to take, Bazan's fleet reached Terceira, which is a Spanish stronghold in a group of newly conquered Portuguese possessions. They hear from some locals that the English are around, and that the total English force is no more than 22 ships, of which only half a dozen or so are of any size. There are a few supply ships wandering around, but that's about it. Now, Bazan's fleet alone outnumbers the English 2 to 1, and of course, not all of those ships are near the Azores. And that's discounting the 70 or so ships in the convoy coming from the West Indies, a number of whom were heavily armed, including some of those new ships we were discussing earlier. Admittedly, a few other ships in that fleet had been snapped up by privateers, but the main force was still intact. Another 8 days later, a good wind from astern propelled Bazan's fleet further on towards their destination. And less than 50 miles away from where the English were, in a place called Flores, they got a recon boat to come back to them and give their exact English location away. Bazan decided to hoist as much sail as possible, since at just under 50 miles, if he sailed through the night, they might just about get on top of the English at first light the next day, with all the advantage of surprise and all day to use it. However, this bold plan and this kind of leadership, which definitely could have been used a few years earlier when the Spanish sailed up the channel, ran into a bit of a snag. One of his new galleons had broken her bowsprit, and therefore not much sail could be put on, as a whole load of rigging was slack, and the bowsprit sail itself was obviously unusable. Showing an admirable dedication to his men, he decided that rather than leave a single ship behind in waters that he knew held enemy warships, he was going to keep the rest of his fleet back and help the ship along and help it make repairs. This probably cost him a fair bit in terms of martial results, because it meant that his original plan to divide his forces and encircle the island and pin the English in place completely was now no longer possible. And so the English would have room to escape. On top of that, the Moonshine arrived a few hours ahead of Bazan and had managed to warn the English squadrons of the approach of this new war fleet. But the ships, as we said before, had offloaded pretty much everything in an effort to clean themselves out and heal some of the sick up, so they couldn't really run away very quickly. They also needed to gather up supplies of fresh water and then bring all the sick men back on board. It would be a very near-run thing, as the Spanish forces came over the horizon with all sails set at a time when the English squadron was struggling to head north and try and get away. The Revenge was the last ship to leave the anchorage as it was waiting for the last of the sick men to be brought aboard, and it became rapidly clear that it would not manage to get up past and around the Spanish before they could cut it off. Sir Richard Grenville was urged instead to rely on Revenge's superb sailing qualities, cut his losses, and run with the wind heading west. This would, of course, take him further away from home and safety, but the Revenge was a very good sailor, and it was reckoned that if they spent a few days running to the west, then they could elude the Spanish, lose sight of them, and then cut up round and head home anyway. He decided, however, that he was not one for running. He was going to sail right at the Spanish and force them to give way. The rest of the English squadron, meanwhile, managed to use their slight head start compared to the Revenge and their superior sailing qualities to get the better of the Spanish who tried to engage them. The Spanish attempted to board, but failed, and the English ships managed to slip away into the north. Now, Sir Richard's thinking of charging the Spanish was not entirely without foundation. During the engagement with the Spanish Armada not so long ago, the Spanish gunnery had been incredibly inaccurate and glacially slow. It's possible that he was gambling on this to keep his masts and rigging preserved from crippling damage by baiting the Spanish into firing too early and then using the speed and agility of his ship to burst through their lines and head for home in glorious style. Unfortunately for him, the leading Spanish ship was the San Felipe, and at 1,500 tons, it was 3 times the displacement of the Revenge. As well as this, although being a much more ocean-going warship than its predecessors in the Armada, it still had the towering hull and fore and after castles characteristic of Spanish galleons, and therefore was a lot taller than the low-cut Revenge. Between this and her massive spread of canvas, she actually blocked the wind to the English galleon as it tried to pass. The Revenge immediately lost speed and would not answer the helm, her rudder moving fruitlessly in the still pocket of water created by the shadow of the massive Spanish vessel. That run for freedom, therefore, was pretty much over before it had begun. The San Felipe then smashed straight alongside the Revenge with a great rumbling and straining of timbers. 9 or 10 Spaniards then leapt down onto the deck of the Revenge, with a rope thrown after them, which they secured to the hull. Unfortunately, though, the English galleon was now pretty much stationary, and the 1,500 tons of San Felipe took a lot of stopping. It was therefore still moving, and the rope went immediately taut and began to make some rather ominous noises that had both the Spanish and English on deck looking at it with very worried expressions on their face. It quivered, and then with a thunder crack, it came apart, and the Revenge was free. Unfortunately, coming up behind the San Felipe was the San Barnabé. In her was Martin de Bertandona. He was a veteran of the Armada defeat, and he had some scores to settle. Instead of going straight for the board, he closed in on the Revenge on the other side before the English ship could get moving again. This time, instead of a few men with a rope, proper grappling irons come across, and these hold. Revenge, it was not completely toothless. It fired its lower battery of guns, which was the heaviest guns on the ship, into the San Felipe, which was forced to sheer off and abandon her boarders to preserve her hull and start to make immediate repairs. 7 of the 9 or 10 who jumped aboard were killed, but the survivors managed to escape across the Revenge to the San Barnabé, which was now firmly locked in with the Revenge. By this point, it was growing dark, as the Spanish, holding back to assist their crippled friend earlier the previous day, had resulted in them still being about 8 leagues away when dawn broke. So, the Revenge is in a bit of a pickle. Its companions have hoisted their mainsails and run for England, and Bazan and some of his best and newest ships are chasing them. They will nearly catch up to the Defiance, but didn't manage to pick up any of the others. A famous victory had been lost, albeit, I would say, probably for the best of reasons. This, however, was not really known, and even if it had been, would have been of scant comfort to the men of the Revenge, who had rather more immediate issues to worry about. Revenge wasn't entirely alone, however. One of the rather small and very lightly armed supply ships, the George Noble, had taken a few shots and come in next to the Revenge on its disengaged side, asking Sir Richard Grenville what he wanted them to do. The ship was a tiny little supply vessel, but it was perfectly happy to fight and die alongside the larger galleon. However, Grenville said to save themselves and sent him on his way. Somewhere in the growing darkness nearby, and quietly hoping that the Spanish would think he was just another Spaniard happily going along, don't mind him, was the Pilgrim. And since the Pilgrim was under the command of Jacob Whiddon, who was also a West Countryman, the Pilgrim was rather loath to abandon the Revenge to the enemy. Unfortunately, every Spanish vessel had a lot of soldiers on board, and the English at this point did not have any apart from the few gentlemen volunteers and servants. And so the Pilgrim did its best to pretend to be a Spanish galleon for the night. Now, although the castles in the bow and stern of the English galleons built at the time of just before the Armada were significantly cut down compared to those of, say, Henry Grace à Dieu or the Mary Rose, or indeed the Spanish ships that were around at the moment, they were still really castles. Forecastle and aftercastle were not a joke back then. When a boarding couldn't be prevented, the idea was for the crew to shut themselves up in there and continue to resist. This is why although it may seem paradoxical to us, there were cannons mounted in the after part of the forecastle and the forward part of the aftercastle. And when you look at them, you think, well, hang on a minute, those just range straight down the ship's own decks. What on earth could that be for? Well, this was exactly the situation those were for. They were lightweight anti-personnel guns, and they wouldn't penetrate the thick timbers of the opposite castle, but they would do a fair number on anybody who was standing in between. So, with these heavily reinforced, heavily planked castles occupied, the ladders that led to them being drawn up, the crewmen of the Revenge, still grappled in with San Barnabe, were waiting for the inevitable. However, reinforced as the castles were, they were still lighter planked than the heavy planks used down near the waterline, for rather obvious stability reasons. The Spanish, having seen just how badly damaged San Felipe had been by a single broadside of English heavy guns, decided that their best course of action was to try and clear the castles with gunfire. And so, as the night drew on, at least 15 Spanish ships would take their turns to try and board and capture the Revenge. After San Felipe had been sent packing, another ship had come up, nudging its bow castle against the poop deck of the English galleon. Spanish soldiers leapt on board the upper deck, captured the Revenge's ensign, and killed some of her men. They fought their way forward as far as the mainmast. However, the English guns lower down spoke again, and between that and the collision, with the poop deck being obviously at the back of the ship, this third Spanish vessel sustained severe structural damage and, like the San Felipe, had been forced to sheer off and light flares for assistance. Well, that was 2 out of 3, so Revenge was doing fairly well at this point. But next up, the Spanish, who had plenty of ships to spare, sent in the galleon Ascension, and this went and boarded at the front of the Revenge, and also across the rather embattled San Bernabe's front deck as well, in a kind of glorified capital T position. With parking space immediately next to the Revenge somewhat at a premium, another Spanish ship came up next to the Ascension, and its crew simply used the Ascension as a bridge to get to the Revenge. Whilst all this was going on, of course, the Spanish were also unloading gunfire into the lower parts of Revenge, trying to silence the annoying English gunners. This went on for hours. Every Spanish assault was beaten back, either into their ships, if the ships were still there, or if the ships had been forced to sheer away by the Revenge's heavy guns lower down, the boarders were unceremoniously shoved off into the sea. Bear in mind, this all started just before darkness. It was now an hour before midnight, and at this point, Sir Richard Grenville, who's standing on the stern, is shot by a musket ball in the body. Obviously, he's been commanding the ship during this entire time. A surgeon nearby begins to dress his wound, which might have been survivable, but then he's shot again in the head, and the surgeon next to him is killed by other fire. During this entire time, there are never any fewer than 2 galleons alongside the Revenge of various types, shooting into her lower decks and sending away boarding parties. One of the crew on board said that he was not able to move one way or the other, but as the sea was moved with the waves and the billow of the sea. The Revenge was in a bit of a difficult spot, because although she was succeeding against multiple waves of boarding, each enemy ship, as it was either damaged by the lower gun decks or had its crew diminished by the fortifications of the forecastle and aftercastle, could simply retire and be replaced with fresh ships and fresh soldiers. The Revenge's masts were completely gone, but the lower gun decks still continue to fire. The range being point blank, obviously the shot was hurting quite badly. The Ascension, the ship that had come up on the bow shortly after San Bernabe and another vessel had been forced to sheer off, took so much damage that it sank later that night. The flagship of Don Luis Cuitino went down the next day. And, yeah, so it went throughout the entire night. Unbelievably, with an entire Spanish fleet taxi ranking in there waiting their turn to have a crack at the English ship, dawn broke and the Revenge was still in English hands. Of its 250 crew, 90 of them, as we said before, had been too ill to move and were still out of action and had been out of action all through. But of the remaining 160 active crew, only 100 had been fully fit for battle, with the remaining 60 ill but not completely debilitated. And by morning, 40 of these were dead. Most of the remainder were wounded. Most of her powder was spent. All the pikes were broken. One of the crew described her situation thus: her masts were all beaten overboard, all her tackle cut asunder, her upper works altogether razed, and in effect evened she was with the water. But the very foundation or bottom of the ship, nothing really being left overhead either for flight or defence. The ship had effectively been battered into a hulk that was maybe a few feet above the water. Grenville, although seriously wounded by that shot to the head, was also somehow still alive. And although you might expect that being shot by an arquebus in the head might give you something of a shock to the system and rather discourage you from further action, this does not seem to be have had this effect on Grenville. Grenville instead appears to have just become really, really angry. He decided that above anything else, he was not going to lose the revenge to the Spanish. He was not going to surrender, and as the daylight began to increase and everyone saw just how many more Spanish ships there were still waiting, he ordered the master gunner to use what was left of the ship's powder to blow a hole in the ship's bottom and sink her, even though this would take down himself and all the other badly wounded and sick men. However, many of the others on board had a slightly more pragmatic view, pointing out that although a number of their comrades were not going to survive, there were many others who, although injured, could survive if they weren't chucked into the water, and therefore might be ransomed back or otherwise rescued, and render the country and crown acceptable service afterwards. They advocated asking the enemy for terms, and were relatively sure at this point, given the absolute battering the Revenge had given the Spanish fleet, that the Spanish would be willing to give them rather than risk yet another brand new warship getting badly shot up. Grenville declared that he did not want the Spanish to have the glory of the capture of even one of Her Majesty's ships. The rest of them replied that Revenge had 6 feet of water in her hold, 3 massive shot holes below the waterline, which they'd barely managed to patch, and was not likely to survive the first rough sea they encountered. The master of the Revenge, who had himself been wounded up to 12 times in the head and body, according to one of the men aboard the Spanish flagship who saw him, before he died a few days later, was taken aboard the San Pablo, and he did manage to secure favourable terms of surrender. The ship's company were to be repatriated back to England, the officers were to pay a reasonable ransom, and in the meantime, the officers at least would be free from galley service or prison. When the news was brought back to the Revenge, everybody except Grenville and the master gunner were fairly glad to accept the terms. The Revenge was now in the aftermath of the battle, the ship being described as marvellous unsavoury, filled with blood and bodies of dead and wounded men like a slaughterhouse. Grenville finally allowed himself the luxury of passing out whilst he was being carried to the Spanish flagship, and then, once he revived, he asked the ship's company to pray for him. He would need it, and the Spanish did treat him with a fair degree of respect, even admiration, given the struggle he had so gallantly commanded. Unfortunately, even for a man such as Grenville, sheer force of anger alone could not countermand an arquebus to the head, and a day or two later he would also die of his wounds. For all their troubles and their losses and their battered ships, Bazan's fleet, with the Revenge in tow, finally joined up with the fleet of ships coming back from the West Indies. This combined force, now amounting to 140 ships, plus Revenge, set sail for Spain. But with the delay imposed by the Revenge, they were almost immediately struck and dispersed by the worst storm in living memory. And bear in mind, that's a statement that was made by people who had survived the weather that smashed the Spanish Armada. Not only was it incredibly violent, it lasted for more than a week. Once it subsided, the bodies of drowned men were driven ashore amongst the islands of the Azores for 3 weeks further. Many ships went down, and not a few, in large part due to the battering received at the Revenge's hands in that long struggle during the night. From many ships, there would be no survivors. The captured Revenge, it may not surprise you to find, was cut away from the ship that was towing it near the island of Terceira, where it broke up into hundreds of pieces and sank without a trace. Philip Gordy and William Monson were both to find themselves in prison in Lisbon, in the castle, as they had been lucky enough to be transported in a couple of the Spanish ships that had actually survived the massive storm. They then got to watch the triumphant return of the galleon San Andreas. According to Monson, on being upon the walls at our usual hour, we beheld a great galleon of the king's turning up the river in her fighting sails, being sumptuously decked out with ensigns, streamers, and pendants, with all other ornaments to show her bravery. She let fly all her ordnance in a triumphant manner for the taking of Sir Richard Grenville in the Revenge at the island of Flores, she being one of that fleet, and the first voyage she ever made. The fact that a good portion of that fleet was on the bottom of the ocean and the Revenge was nowhere to be seen was, of course, quietly dusted over. The sight of the ship coming up to Lisbon and bragging over such a victory irritated Monson so much that he wagered with another prisoner that he would live to see her taken. That was a bet he would win. A few years later, in 1596, during an English attack on Cadiz, a number of English ships, including some of those with survivors from the Revenge, would attack the San Andreas and the San Felipe. The former, the San Andreas, was captured and brought into English service, and the San Felipe was burnt. Whether or not Grenville was right to try and run his one ship through a Spanish fleet that outnumbered him more than 50-1 is, of course, something for debate. He certainly could have had a plan in doing so, but the general consensus, even amongst his peers at the time, was that it was exceedingly reckless, and whilst the stand may well have been glorious, it was not really a martial one. It was more a matter of pride gone horribly wrong. That said, everybody also acknowledged that the bravery and sheer endurance of the crew and the ship were something to be lauded and applauded beyond all reasonable measure. And indeed, to be honest, if you are one ship and you can hold off 50 bigger ships over an entire night and part of a morning, and then thanks to your constant gunnery and crew depopulation efforts be indirectly responsible for sending a whole bunch of new enemy warships to the bottom, you can probably rest easy knowing that your fight against all the odds was not entirely in vain.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.